The thunderous crack of gunfire pierced the quiet Montana evening as the wagon burst into flames, sending embers spiraling toward the darkening sky like desperate prayers. Victoria Maynard had mere seconds to escape with her life, the heat searing her skin as she flung herself from the burning carriage into the unknown wilderness that stretched before her like an endless sea of uncertainty. Montana Territory, 1875. Colton Whittaker crouched by the stream, filling his canteen in the dying light of day when he heard the distant explosion. His weathered face, tanned from years under the relentless western sun, turned toward the sound. At 32, he'd learned to distinguish between the ordinary pops and cracks of frontier life and the unmistakable sound of trouble. This was decidedly the latter. Mounting his chestnut stallion with practiced ease, Colton rode toward the glow on the horizon. The former cavalry scout had built a reputation in these parts as a man who minded his business, but something in his gut told him this wasn't a night for solitude. As he crested the ridge overlooking the valley, the sight of a wagon consumed by flames sent him galloping forward. He was scanning the area for survivors when he saw a woman staggering through the tall grass, her dress singed and torn. She managed perhaps 10 more steps before her legs gave way, and she collapsed at his feet just as he dismounted. "Miss, can you hear me?" Colton gently turned her over, noting the smudges of ash across her delicate features. Her eyelids fluttered momentarily, revealing eyes the color of summer sage before they closed again. She was breathing, but barely. Victoria Maynard had never intended to come west. At 24, she had been content with her life in Boston, teaching children to read and write. But after her father's death and the revelation of his gambling debts, she had no choice but to accept her uncle's invitation to join him in Montana. Now, as consciousness slipped away, she wondered if she would die before ever reaching his homestead. Colton worked quickly, wrapping Victoria in his woolen blanket before securing her to his horse. The wagon was beyond saving, the wooden frame already collapsing into itself as the flames consumed it completely. He searched briefly for other survivors, but found none. With darkness settling across the land and the woman's condition uncertain, he had no choice but to take her to his cabin a few miles to the north. The one-room structure that Colton called home was sparse but sturdy. Built with his own hands 3 years prior, it represented everything he valued: independence, solitude, and the quiet dignity of self-reliance. As he carried the unconscious woman across the threshold, he couldn't help but feel the irony of bringing chaos into his carefully ordered existence. He laid her gently on his bed, then lit a lantern to better assess her injuries. The firelight cast a golden glow across her face, revealing features that might have belonged to a porcelain doll: high cheekbones, a delicate nose, and lips that even in unconsciousness held a hint of determination. Her hair, freed from its pins during her ordeal, cascaded across his pillow in waves of chestnut brown. "What happened to you?" he murmured, though he expected no answer. He dampened a cloth and began to clean the soot from her face. As he worked, he noticed a gold locket around her neck, somehow untouched by the destruction that had claimed everything else. Victoria awakened with a start, her eyes flying open as a cry escaped her lips. She tried to sit up, but firm hands pressed her shoulders back down. "Easy now," a deep voice cautioned. "You're safe." Her vision cleared slowly, revealing a man she'd never seen before. He sat beside the bed, his expression concerned but guarded. Behind him, a fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the log walls. "Who are you?" Victoria demanded, her voice raw from smoke. "Where am I?" "Name's Colton Whittaker. This is my cabin about 10 miles east of Hollow Creek." He offered her a cup of water, which she accepted after a moment's hesitation. "Found you collapsed near a burning wagon. Care to tell me what happened?" Victoria's hands trembled as memories flooded back. "We were attacked," she whispered. "Highwaymen, 3 of them. They wanted the strongbox the driver was carrying." Her eyes widened suddenly. "The driver, Mr. Hobbs, is he?" Colton shook his head slowly. "I didn't find anyone else. I'm sorry." Tears welled in her eyes, but she fought them back. He was kind to me, said he'd been driving the stage route for 20 years without incident. A bitter laugh escaped her. I thought that meant we'd be safe. No one's truly safe out here, Colton replied, his voice neither unkind nor comforting, simply truthful. The territory's changing, but not fast enough for some. Victoria studied him properly for the first time. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with features that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors. His hair, the color of dark honey, was longer than fashion dictated, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a mouth that seemed unaccustomed to smiling. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, blue as a mountain lake and just as deep. "Thank you," she said finally. "For saving me," he nodded once, accepting her gratitude without comment. "You need rest. We can figure out what to do with you in the morning." "What to do with me?" Victoria repeated, indignation flaring. "I'm not a lost parcel to be redirected, Mr. Whittaker. I am on my way to my uncle's homestead near Fort Benton. Once I'm recovered, I'll continue my journey." A hint of amusement crossed his face. "And how do you plan to do that, Miss?" "Maynard." Victoria Maynard. She tried to maintain her dignity despite being bedridden in a stranger's cabin. "I'll hire another wagon, of course. With what money? I didn't find any luggage that survived the fire." The reality of her situation struck Victoria like a physical blow. Everything she owned, clothes, books, the small amount of money she'd brought with her, all gone. She was stranded in the wilderness with nothing but the damaged clothes on her back and a locket containing her parents' portraits. "I see," she said quietly, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Then I suppose I am at your mercy, Mr. Whittaker." Colton stood abruptly. "You're at no one's mercy, Miss Maynard. I'll take you to Hollow Creek when you're well enough to travel. They've got a telegraph office. You can contact your uncle from there." He moved to a chest in the corner, extracting a clean shirt and pair of trousers. "These will be too big, but they're clean. Your dress is." He gestured vaguely at the scorched fabric. "I'll step outside while you change. Call when you're decent." Left alone, Victoria allowed herself one moment of complete despair. She pressed her face into the pillow and released a silent scream, her body shaking with the effort of containing her fear and grief. Then, drawing a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and began the awkward process of changing into the offered clothes. Colton's shirt hung to her knees, and she had to roll the trousers' waistband several times to keep them from falling off completely. She used one of his leather belts to secure them further, feeling ridiculous but grateful for the clean garments. "You can come back in," she called, perching awkwardly on the edge of the bed. Colton returned with an armful of firewood, which he stacked beside the hearth before adding several logs to the flames. "Nights get cold, even in summer," he explained. "I'll sleep by the fire, you take the bed." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," he interrupted. "You need proper rest to recover." Victoria watched as he efficiently prepared a bedroll on the floor. "Have you lived out here long?" she asked, desperate to fill the uncomfortable silence. 3 years in this cabin, been in the territory since '67. "After the war," he nodded. "Served with the Union cavalry, scouting mainly. And now I trap in winter, guide hunting parties in summer, and keep to myself the rest of the time." He glanced at her. "What brings a proper Eastern lady to Montana? Your uncle the only family you have left." Victoria touched her locket unconsciously. "My father died 6 months ago. There were financial difficulties. My uncle offered me a home and a position teaching at the settlement school. Fort Benton's growing," Colton acknowledged. "Still rough around the edges, but they're building something resembling civilization." "Unlike you, who prefers the wilderness," Victoria observed. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "The wilderness is honest, at least. No pretense, no false promises, just survival." "That sounds terribly lonely." "I prefer to think of it as peaceful." He extinguished the lantern, leaving only the firelight to illuminate the cabin. "Get some sleep, Miss Maynard. Morning comes early out here." Victoria lay awake long after Colton's breathing had deepened into sleep. Her body ached from the fall, and her mind raced with questions about what would happen next. The attack replayed in her memories the sudden appearance of masked men on horseback, the driver's desperate attempt to outrun them, the terrible moment when the first shot was fired. She wondered about the strongbox they'd been so determined to steal. Mr. Hobbs had mentioned it contained the monthly payroll for miners at a nearby silver operation. Worth killing for, apparently, in this wild territory where law was still more concept than reality. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into uneasy dreams of fire and pursuit. Dawn arrived with a chorus of birdsong and the rich aroma of coffee. Victoria opened her eyes to find Colton already dressed and moving quietly around the cabin. He had rekindled the fire and was frying bacon in a cast-iron skillet. "Good morning," she said, sitting up gingerly. Every muscle protested the movement, but her head felt clearer than it had the night before. "Morning." He poured coffee into a tin mug and brought it to her. "How are you feeling?" "Like I jumped from a moving wagon," she admitted with a wry smile, accepting the coffee gratefully. "But better than yesterday." Colton nodded, returning to the skillet. "Good, we need to get to town, report what happened. Sheriff will want to know about the robbery." Victoria sipped the strong coffee, grimacing slightly at the bitterness. "Do you think they'll catch the men who did this?" "Unlikely," Colton replied bluntly. "Territory's too vast, too many places to hide, but they need to know regardless." He served breakfast on simple tin plates, bacon, beans, and johnny cake. Victoria found herself ravenous, despite the plain fare. They ate in companionable silence, the awkwardness of the previous night somewhat diminished in the light of day. "I've been thinking," Colton said as he collected their empty plates. "Your uncle's place is what, another 80 miles north?" "Yes, near Fort Benton." "That's at least a week's journey from Hollow Creek, assuming you can find transportation." He hesitated. "I have business in Fort Benton next month, trading furs, picking up supplies for winter. If you can't arrange passage sooner, I could take you." Victoria studied him carefully. "Why would you do that? You don't know me," he shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "Wouldn't be right to leave you stranded. Besides, I'm heading that way regardless." "That's very kind, Mr. Whittaker, but I'm sure once I contact my uncle, he'll arrange something." "Of course." Colton moved toward the door. "I'll saddle the horses. We should reach town by midday if we leave soon." Left alone, Victoria attempted to make herself presentable. She found a cracked mirror hanging near the wash basin and nearly gasped at her reflection. Her face was scratched and smudged, her hair a tangled mess. Using Colton's comb and wash basin, she did what she could to restore some semblance of order. When she emerged from the cabin, Colton was waiting with 2 horses, his chestnut stallion and a dappled gray mare. "Can you ride?" he asked, offering her a hand up. "Yes, though it's been some time," Victoria admitted. She'd learned as a girl but had few opportunities to practice in Boston. Daisy's gentle. She'll follow Ghost's lead without much guidance. The ride to Hollow Creek was challenging for Victoria. Each hoofbeat sent jolts of pain through her bruised body, but she refused to complain. The Montana landscape stretched around them in breathtaking majesty, rolling hills covered in summer wildflowers, distant mountains capped with snow even in June, and a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the earth. "It's beautiful," she murmured, almost to herself. Colton glanced back. "Most people only see the hardship, the cold, the isolation, the dangers. They miss this." He gestured to the panorama before them. "Is that why you stay, for the beauty?" He considered the question seriously. "Partly. But mostly because out here, a man can be judged by what he does, not where he came from or who his family was." Victoria nodded, understanding. Even in progressive Boston, family connections and social standing mattered more than they should. Hollow Creek appeared suddenly as they crested a hill, a collection of wooden buildings straddling a rushing stream. Though small by Eastern standards, the town boasted a general store, saloon, livery stable, and the all-important telegraph office. "Sheriff's office is there," Colton pointed to a small building with a wooden star nailed above the door. "I'll take you there first, then to the boarding house. Mrs. Peterson runs it. She might have something you can wear." Victoria suddenly felt acutely conscious of her appearance, dressed in men's clothing and riding into town with a virtual stranger. "People will talk," she said quietly. "People always talk," Colton replied. "Doesn't mean you have to listen." Sheriff Daniel Foster was a former Texas Ranger with a weathered face and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. He listened carefully as Victoria recounted the attack, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound ledger. 3 men, you say? Any distinguishing features you can recall? Victoria closed her eyes, trying to remember details through the haze of terror. They wore bandanas over their faces. One had a scar through his right eyebrow. The leader was tall with a black horse he called one of the others Riggs when he told him to check the strongbox. The sheriff's head snapped up. Riggs, you say? Could be Tom Riggs. He runs with the Blackwell gang. They've hit a couple of stagecoaches further south. He turned to Colton. Where exactly did this happen? About 10 miles west, near Serpent Ridge. Sheriff Foster nodded grimly. I'll send wires up and down the line, but they're likely long gone. Miss Maynard, I'm mighty sorry about what happened to you. Glad Whittaker here found you when he did. As am I, Victoria replied sincerely. After leaving the sheriff's office, Colton escorted Victoria to Peterson's boarding house, where the proprietress, a plump, motherly woman with iron-gray hair, immediately took charge. Land's sakes, child, look at you. Come in. We'll get you fixed right up. She turned to Colton with narrowed eyes. You found her, did you, Whittaker? Yes, madam, he replied, removing his hat respectfully. Her wagon was attacked yesterday evening, Mrs. Peterson sniffed. Well, at least you had the decency to bring her to town instead of keeping her out at that hermit cabin of yours. Folks might talk either way, but this looks more proper. Victoria felt a blush creep up her neck. Mr. Whittaker has been a perfect gentleman, I assure you. I should hope so, Mrs. Peterson replied, though her expression softened. Come along now, dear. I have a room ready, and my daughter left some dresses that might fit you with a bit of taking in. Colton cleared his throat. Miss Maynard needs to send a telegraph to her uncle near Fort Benton. He'll want to know what happened, of course, after she's rested and changed. Mrs. Peterson began steering Victoria toward the stairs. You can see yourself out, Mr. Whittaker. Victoria turned back. Thank you again, Mr. Whittaker. I'm not sure how to repay your kindness. No need, he replied, settling his hat back on his head. I'll check on you tomorrow, see if you've heard from your uncle. With that, he was gone, leaving Victoria with a strange, hollow feeling despite Mrs. Peterson's comforting presence. The next 3 days passed in an odd limbo. Victoria sent a telegraph to her uncle explaining what had happened and received a distressing reply. He was away on business in Helena and wouldn't return for at least 2 weeks. He would arrange transportation then, but could not come sooner, Mrs. Peterson was kindness itself, providing Victoria with clean dresses, meals, and a comfortable room. The boarding house's other occupants, 2 traveling salesmen and an elderly gentleman awaiting the arrival of his daughter from Sacramento, were polite but distant. Colton visited each day, initially just to check on her recovery, but gradually staying longer to share a cup of coffee or accompany her on short walks around the small town. Victoria found herself looking forward to these visits more than she cared to admit. On the 4th day, as they sat on the boarding house porch watching a summer storm roll in across the valley, Colton made his offer again. I'm leaving for Fort Benton in 3 days, he said, his eyes on the darkening horizon. My offer stands if you want to travel with me. Probably reach your uncle's place before he gets back from Helena. Victoria considered the proposal. She'd grown restless in Hollow Creek despite Mrs. Peterson's hospitality. The thought of waiting 2 more weeks seemed unbearable. I wouldn't want to impose, she said carefully. It's not an imposition. I'm going anyway, and 2 traveling together is safer than 1. He glanced at her. Besides, I could use the company. The admission surprised her, coming from a man who valued solitude so highly. You'd have to put up with my endless questions about everything we see, she warned, a smile playing at her lips. I reckon I could manage that, Victoria nodded slowly. Then yes, Mr. Whittaker, I accept your offer. Colton, he said. If we're traveling together for a week, might as well use my given name. Colton, she repeated, liking the way it felt in her mouth, and you must call me Victoria. The first raindrops began to fall, fat and heavy, spattering the dusty street. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Colton stood. Storm's coming in fast. I should get back to my camp before it hits, Victoria frowned. You're camping outside town. Why not stay at the boarding house? Too many walls, too many people, he replied simply. I prefer the open air. As if to contradict him, the skies opened up, sending a torrent of rain across the street. Victoria laughed at his disgruntled expression. Perhaps just this once the boarding house would be the wiser choice, she suggested. Mrs. Peterson has an empty room. Colton hesitated, then nodded reluctantly as another crack of thunder shook the air. Just this once. That evening, as rain lashed against the windows, the boarding house residents gathered in the parlor. Mrs. Peterson served apple pie and coffee, and for the first time since the attack, Victoria felt something approaching normalcy. Colton sat slightly apart from the others, uncomfortable with the social setting but making an effort for her sake. When Mr. Jenkins, the elderly gentleman, began reminiscing about his days prospecting for gold in California, Colton surprised everyone by adding details about mining techniques that had the old man nodding appreciatively. You know something about mining, Mr. Whittaker? Victoria asked later as they stood alone in the hallway before retiring to their rooms. Tried my hand at it after the war, he admitted. Found enough color to keep me fed, but nothing worth staying for. Prefer hunting and trapping, less digging, Victoria smiled. You're full of surprises. Not really, he countered. Just lived a bit is all. They stood in silence for a moment, the rain providing a soothing backdrop to the unexpected intimacy of the moment. Good night, Colton, Victoria said finally. Thank you for staying. Good night, Victoria, he replied, his voice softer than she'd heard before. 3 days later, they departed Hollow Creek just after dawn. Mrs. Peterson had supplied them with provisions for the journey and had taken Victoria aside for a whispered conversation about propriety and reputation. Victoria had assured the older woman that Colton was a gentleman and that they would be staying in proper accommodations at any settlements along their route. The truth was somewhat different. The journey to Fort Benton would take them through sparsely populated countryside with only 1 or 2 small outposts along the way. Most nights would be spent camping under the stars. Victoria found she didn't mind. There was something liberating about the vast Montana landscape, so different from Boston's crowded streets and social constraints. Each day brought new vistas, sweeping grasslands, dense pine forests, rushing rivers that caught the sunlight like scattered diamonds. Colton proved to be an excellent guide and a surprisingly good companion. Though still reserved, he answered her endless questions about the flora, fauna, and geography with patience, and occasionally a flash of dry humor that made her laugh unexpectedly. On their 3rd night, camped beside a clear stream, Victoria gathered her courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her. Why do you live alone, Colton? A man with your skills and intelligence could surely find success in any settlement. He poked at the campfire with a stick, sending sparks upward into the darkening sky. For a moment, she thought he might ignore the question entirely. Had a family once, he said finally, his voice low. Wife and a baby girl. Sarah was from Kentucky, met her when I was stationed there before the war. Hannah was born in '63 while I was fighting at Chickamauga. Victoria sat very still, afraid that any movement might cause him to stop. When the war ended, we decided to go west. New start, new land. Made it as far as Nebraska. His jaw tightened. Cholera took them both within a week of each other. Hannah first, then Sarah. I buried them under a cottonwood tree and kept moving west. I'm so sorry, Victoria whispered, understanding now his preference for solitude, his reluctance to form attachments. Colton shrugged, the gesture belying the pain evident in his eyes. It was 10 years ago. You can't change the past, only decide what to do with the time you have left. And you decided to live alone in the wilderness. Seemed simplest. No one to disappoint, no one to lose. Victoria considered his words. My father used to say that the greatest risk in life is never taking one at all. Your father sounds like an optimist. He was, Victoria smiled sadly. Even when his business ventures failed, he always believed the next one would succeed. Is that what happened? Business failures? Victoria nodded. And gambling debts I knew nothing about until after his death. He always seemed so confident, so sure that prosperity was just around the corner. Instead, he left me with nothing but debts and a ticket west to an uncle I barely know. Yet here you are, making the best of it. What choice do I have? She gestured to the wilderness around them. This is my life now, for better or worse. Colton studied her across the fire, his expression unreadable. You're stronger than you think, Victoria Maynard. The words warmed her more than the flames before them. The following day brought an unexpected challenge. As they crossed a shallow river, Victoria's horse stumbled on a slippery rock, throwing her into the cold water. Colton was at her side instantly, pulling her to safety. Are you hurt? He demanded, his hands gripping her shoulders as he searched her face. Just my pride, Victoria gasped, teeth chattering from the cold, and perhaps my tailbone. Relief washed over his features, quickly replaced by concern as he noted her drenched clothing. We need to get you dry before nightfall. Temperatures drop quickly this time of year. They made camp earlier than planned, in a sheltered grove of pines. Colton efficiently set up the tent, built a roaring fire, and disappeared into the woods to give Victoria privacy to change into the spare clothing Mrs. Peterson had packed for her. By the time he returned with an impressive string of trout, Victoria had arranged her wet garments near the fire to dry and was wrapped in a woolen blanket, her damp hair loose around her shoulders. You're quite the provider, she remarked as he began cleaning the fish with practiced movements. Basic survival skills, he replied, but there was a hint of pleasure in his voice at the compliment. As they ate the perfectly cooked fish, Victoria found herself studying Colton's profile in the firelight. The harsh lines of his face had softened somewhat over their days of travel, or perhaps she had simply grown accustomed to his features. Either way, she could now see the handsome man beneath the weathered exterior, the intelligence in his blue eyes, the strength in his jawline, the occasional glimpse of the person he might have been in another life. You're staring, he observed without looking up from his plate. Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. I was just thinking about how people adapt to circumstances. A month ago, I would have been horrified at the thought of sleeping outdoors, eating fish cooked over an open fire, traveling unchaperoned with a man I barely know. And now, his eyes met hers across the flames. Now I find I'm quite enjoying myself despite everything. Perhaps I was meant for adventure after all. A smile touched his lips, a real one that reached his eyes. Maybe you were at that. That night, as Victoria lay in the tent listening to the soft sounds of the wilderness around them and Colton's steady breathing outside by the fire, she realized with startling clarity that she was developing feelings for this solitary woodsman. Feelings that went beyond gratitude or friendship. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. In less than a week, they would reach her uncle's homestead and their journey together would end. Colton would return to his solitary existence, and she would begin her new life as a schoolteacher unless Victoria pushed the thought away. She had known him less than 2 weeks. Such feelings were surely the product of their unusual circumstances, her rescue, their isolated travels together. Once she was settled in Fort Benton, surrounded by other people, these feelings would fade, wouldn't they? The next morning brought another change to their journey. Dark clouds rolled in from the north, carrying with them the promise of a significant storm. We should find shelter, Colton said, eyeing the sky with concern. There's a trading post about 10 miles ahead. We can wait out the worst of it there. They rode at a faster pace, racing against the approaching weather. Victoria could feel the electricity in the air, the peculiar stillness that precedes a major storm. By mid-morning, the first raindrops began to fall, quickly becoming a steady downpour. The trading post materialized like a mirage through the curtain of rain, a sturdy log building with a covered porch and smoke curling from the chimney. They dismounted quickly, leading the horses to a lean-to attached to the main structure. Whittaker. A booming voice greeted them as they stepped inside. Thought you weren't coming through until next month. The speaker was a mountain of a man with a bushy beard and one missing eye covered by a leather patch. Despite his fearsome appearance, his smile was genuine as he clasped Colton's hand. "Change of plans, Burke," Colton replied. "This is Miss Victoria Maynard. She's heading to her uncle's place near Fort Benton. Victoria, this is Jeremiah Burke, finest trader in the territory and worst poker player west of the Mississippi." "Slander and lies," Burke chuckled, tipping his head respectfully to Victoria. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Maynard. Any friend of Whittaker's is welcome at Burke's trading post." The interior was crowded but clean, with goods of every description lining the walls and hanging from the rafters. A pot-bellied stove radiated welcome heat at the center of the room, surrounded by several chairs and a small table where two men were playing cards. Burke's wife, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and capable hands, immediately took charge of Victoria, clucking over her rain-soaked appearance and insisting she change into dry clothes in their private quarters at the back of the building. "That storm's setting in for the duration," she informed Victoria as she handed her a simple but clean dress. "You and Mr. Whittaker are welcome to stay the night. We've got a small room off the storage area, not fancy but dry and warm." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Burke." "Agnes, please." "And it's no kindness, just practical. No sense in anyone traveling in weather like this." She gave Victoria an appraising look. "How long have you known Whittaker?" "Not long," Victoria admitted. "He rescued me after my wagon was attacked by robbers about 10 days ago." Agnes nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like him. Man's got a reputation for keeping to himself, but he'll never turn his back on someone in trouble." She smiled. "He looks at you different, though." Victoria felt her cheeks warm. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, if you say so, dear." Agnes patted her arm. "Come along when you're ready. Jeremiah's putting on a pot of stew that'll warm you right through." By evening, the trading post had become a haven for several travelers caught in the storm. The Burkes served stew and cornbread to their unexpected guests, refusing payment and asking only for news and stories in return. Victoria found herself seated between Colton and a cattle drover from Wyoming, listening to tales of the frontier that ranged from harrowing to hilarious. Colton remained mostly silent, but she noticed how he watched her reactions to the stories, a hint of amusement in his eyes when she gasped at particularly outrageous claims. When the conversation turned to politics and the recent troubles with various native tribes, Victoria was surprised to hear Colton speak up. "Most problems come from broken promises," he said quietly, silencing the table. "Government signs treaties it has no intention of honoring. Can't blame a people for fighting when everything they have is being taken from them." There was a moment of tense silence before Burke nodded. "Man's got a point. The Blackfeet I trade with are fair dealers if treated fairly. It's when the army comes in making demands that trouble starts." The discussion continued more thoughtfully after that, and Victoria found herself looking at Colton with new respect. His understanding of the complex relationships between settlers and native peoples showed a depth of thought she hadn't fully appreciated before. Later, as the other travelers settled in for the night, some in the main room, others in tents pitched beneath the trading post's broad eaves, Agnes showed Victoria and Colton to the small room she'd mentioned. "Only got the one spare bed," she apologized. "But it's big enough for two if you're friendly, or one can take the floor if you're not." She winked at Victoria. "Your arrangement is none of my business, of course." Before Victoria could stammer a response, Colton spoke up. "I'll take the floor, Agnes. Thank you for the accommodation." "Suit yourself," the older woman replied with a knowing smile. "Extra blankets in the chest there. Sleep well, you two." Left alone in the small room, Victoria and Colton stood awkwardly for a moment. Rain drummed steadily on the roof, and occasional thunder rumbled in the distance. "I can sleep elsewhere if you'd be more comfortable," Colton offered, running a hand through his hair. "Don't be ridiculous," Victoria replied, more sharply than she intended. "The floor is hard and you need proper rest as much as I do. The bed is large enough for both of us and we're both adults." He raised an eyebrow at her vehemence, and Victoria felt her face flame again. "What I mean is, there's no need for either of us to be uncomfortable. We can maintain propriety while being practical." A hint of a smile played around his lips. If you're sure, I am. She turned away, pretending to busy herself with arranging the blankets. Besides, after sleeping on the ground for several nights, I imagine we both deserve a real bed. They settled into an uneasy arrangement, both lying rigidly on opposite sides of the mattress with a careful gap between them. Victoria lay awake, acutely conscious of Colton's presence beside her, the sound of his breathing, the warmth radiating from his body. "Victoria," he said softly into the darkness. "Yes, thank you for trusting me." The simple statement touched her deeply. "You've given me every reason to," she replied. Eventually, the rhythm of the rain and the comfort of the bed lulled her to sleep. She dreamed of endless prairie skies and a pair of blue eyes that saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. Morning brought clearing skies and a tacit agreement not to discuss their shared sleeping arrangements. If Agnes Burke had any thoughts on finding them at breakfast with careful distance between them and avoiding each other's eyes, she kept them to herself. "Roads will be muddy," Jeremiah announced as they prepared to depart, "but passable if you stick to the high ground. Should reach Carlson's Crossing by nightfall if you make good time." Victoria thanked the Burkes warmly for their hospitality, promising to stop again when she had the opportunity. As they rode away from the trading post, she felt a curious mixture of emotions, refreshed from a night in a real bed, yet somehow bereft now that she and Colton were back to sleeping separately. The landscape had been transformed by the storm. Colors seemed more vibrant, the air clearer, and wildflowers dotted the prairie in vibrant bursts of purple, yellow, and white. Despite the mud that sometimes slowed their progress, Victoria found herself enjoying the journey more than ever. "Will you come to Fort Benton often?" she asked as they paused to rest the horses near midday. "For trading, I mean," Colton squinted toward the horizon. "Few times a year, usually. Winter furs in spring, supplies before winter sets in. Then perhaps we'll see each other occasionally." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Perhaps. Victoria wanted to say more, to ask if he would visit specifically to see her, to express how much she had come to value his company. But the words stuck in her throat, held back by fear of rejection or, worse, pity. Instead, she changed the subject. "Tell me about Fort Benton." "What should I expect?" As Colton described the frontier town, its location on the Missouri River, its importance as a steamboat landing and trading hub, the mix of people who called it home, Victoria tried to imagine herself there, teaching children in a one-room schoolhouse, living with an uncle she barely remembered from childhood visits. It sounded both exciting and terribly lonely. That evening, they made camp near a small grove of cottonwood trees beside a bubbling creek. After a simple meal of bacon, beans, and hardtack, they sat side by side watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange, pink, and gold. "2 more days to Fort Benton," Colton remarked. "Your uncle's place is about half a day's ride south from there." Victoria nodded, a sudden lump in her throat making speech difficult. 2 more days. Then what? She would become Miss Maynard, the schoolteacher, and Colton would return to his solitary cabin. The thought was unexpectedly painful. "Will you miss this?" she asked impulsively. "Traveling together, I mean." He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, without looking at her, he said yes. The simple admission hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. "I will too," Victoria whispered. Colton turned to her then, his blue eyes reflecting the dying light. Victoria, whatever he might have said, was interrupted by a distant wolf howl, followed by another closer by. Colton was on his feet immediately, reaching for his rifle. "Stay by the fire," he instructed, his voice tense. "Wolves don't usually bother humans, but best to be cautious." He moved to check on the horses, making sure they were securely tethered and calming them with low, soothing words. Victoria watched him, wondering what he had been about to say and whether the moment would come again. That night, as she lay in the tent listening to the occasional wolf call and Colton's movements as he kept watch, Victoria confronted the truth she had been avoiding. She was falling in love with him. Not just gratitude for her rescue, not just admiration for his skills and knowledge, but a deep and growing affection for the man himself, his quiet strength, His unexpected kindness, his unwavering integrity. It was foolish, of course. What future could there be for an educated Boston woman and a solitary mountain man? Their worlds were too different, their paths too divergent, and yet, the following day's journey took them through increasingly settled countryside. They passed several homesteads, fields of grain rippling in the summer breeze, and even a small church standing alone on a hilltop. Signs of civilization that should have comforted Victoria, but instead filled her with a strange melancholy. Colton was quieter than usual, focused on the trail ahead. When they stopped to water the horses at a small stream, Victoria finally broke the strained silence. "Is something wrong?" He shook his head, not meeting her eyes, just thinking about tomorrow, Fort Benton. What comes next? Victoria's heart quickened. And what does come next, Colton? Now he did look at her, his expression conflicted. You start your new life, teaching, living with your uncle, building something for yourself, and you go back to your cabin and your solitude. He nodded slowly. That was always the plan. Plans can change, Victoria said quietly, gathering her courage. People can change. Colton's jaw tightened. Some things don't change, Victoria. I'm not meant for town life, for being around people day in and day out. I tried that once after Sarah and Hannah died. Couldn't breathe with all those expectations, all those watchful eyes. I'm not asking you to change who you are, Victoria protested. I'm just suggesting that perhaps there might be a middle ground. He looked at her sharply. What are you saying? Victoria took a deep breath. I'm saying that I care for you, Colton, more than I expected to, more than is probably wise, and I hope that you might feel something for me as well. For a moment, hope flared in his eyes, quickly replaced by a guarded wariness. You don't know what you're asking for. Life out here isn't easy, especially for a woman used to Eastern comforts. I'm stronger than I look, Victoria replied, echoing his own words back to him, and I'm not afraid of hard work or hardship. It's not just that. Colton ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I've been alone a long time, Victoria. I don't know if I remember how to be anything else. The raw honesty in his voice made her heart ache. Perhaps you don't have to figure it out all at once, she suggested gently. Perhaps we could just see each other occasionally. When you come to Fort Benton for supplies, or if I were to visit your part of the territory. Colton stared at her for a long moment, conflicting emotions playing across his face. Finally, he nodded. I'd like that. It wasn't a declaration of love or a promise of forever, but Victoria felt a weight lift from her shoulders nonetheless. It was a beginning, a possibility, and for now, that was enough. They made camp that night beneath a canopy of stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch. After dinner, Colton surprised Victoria by producing a small flask of whiskey from his saddlebag. Medicinal purposes, he explained with a hint of a smile, offering her the first sip. Victoria took a cautious taste, coughing slightly at the burn. Is this medicine or poison? Colton laughed a real laugh that transformed his face and made him look years younger. Bit of both, maybe. They passed the flask back and forth, talking more freely than they had before. Victoria told him about her childhood in Boston, her father's business ventures and inevitable failures, her brief engagement to a banker's son that ended when she discovered his interest lay more in her family's social connections than in her. Colton spoke of his youth in Pennsylvania, his decision to join the Union Army despite his father's objections, his early days with Sarah and their dreams of building a life together in the West. There was pain in the telling, but also a sense that sharing these memories was somehow healing. She would have liked you, he said suddenly. Sarah, she valued honesty and courage above all else. Victoria blinked back unexpected tears at the compliment. I wish I could have known her. So do I. He stared into the fire, lost in memory for a moment, then looked up with a small smile. But I'm glad I know you, Victoria Maynard. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the final day of their journey to Fort Benton. As they broke camp, Victoria felt a curious mixture of anticipation and regret. She was eager to see her uncle, to begin her new life, but reluctant for her time with Colton to end. They rode mostly in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. By mid-afternoon, they crested a hill and saw Fort Benton spread before them, a bustling frontier town nestled along the Missouri River. Steamboats docked at the levee, buildings ranging from crude log structures to more substantial brick and stone edifices. "There it is," Colton said, reining in his horse. "Your new home." Victoria gazed at the town, trying to imagine herself there. "It's larger than I expected. Busiest port between St. Louis and the Rockies," Colton replied. "All the trade from Canada and the Northern Territories passes through here." They continued down toward the town, Victoria's stomach tightening with nerves. What if her uncle had returned early from Helena? What would he think of her arriving with Colton? What if teaching proved more difficult than she anticipated? As if sensing her anxiety, Colton reached across to touch her arm briefly. "You'll do fine," he said. "Those children won't know what hit them once Miss Maynard takes charge." His confidence in her warmed Victoria from within, steadying her nerves as they rode into town. Fort Benton was indeed bustling, the streets filled with a diverse array of people, from well-dressed businessmen to rough-looking rivermen, Native Americans trading furs and Chinese laborers. Victoria drew curious glances as they made their way toward the hotel where they planned to inquire about her uncle's exact location. The Grand Northern Hotel was the town's most impressive, building 3 stories of painted clapboard with a wide veranda and large windows. As they dismounted, the door opened, and a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver-streaked dark hair emerged. "Victoria," he called, his face breaking into a surprised smile. "Good heavens, is that you, Uncle Edward?" Victoria exclaimed, recognizing him despite the years since their last meeting. Edward Maynard hurried down the steps to embrace his niece. "I just arrived back from Helena this morning and found your telegram waiting for me. I was about to organize a search party to find you." He held her at arm's length, examining her with concern. "Are you all right? The telegram mentioned a robbery, a burned wagon." "I'm fine, Uncle, truly," Victoria assured him. "Thanks to Mr. Whittaker here. He found me after the attack and has escorted me safely to Fort Benton." Edward turned to Colton, extending his hand. "Mr. Whittaker, I am forever in your debt for protecting my niece. Please, you must be my guest for dinner tonight." Colton shook the offered hand, looking uncomfortable with the effusive gratitude. "No debt necessary, sir." "Anyone would have done the same." "Nonsense," Edward insisted. "Not everyone would have taken such responsibility. Please say you'll join us this evening. I want to hear the full story, and I'm sure Victoria would appreciate a familiar face on her first night in town." Colton glanced at Victoria, who nodded encouragingly. "All right," he agreed reluctantly. "Thank you." Edward beamed. "Excellent. Now, Victoria, let's get you settled. I have a buggy waiting. We'll head out to the homestead right away. Mr. Whittaker, shall we expect you at 6? With arrangements made for dinner, Victoria found herself whisked away in her uncle's buggy, casting one last glance at Colton standing alone beside his horse, looking oddly lost amidst the bustle of the town. Edward Maynard's homestead proved to be a substantial property about 5 miles south of Fort Benton, a large 2-story house, a barn, several outbuildings, and cultivated fields stretching toward distant hills. Victoria was surprised by the evident prosperity. "This is not what I expected," she admitted as her uncle helped her from the buggy. Edward chuckled. "What did you expect? A sod house and a few chickens?" "Something like that," Victoria confessed. "Father always spoke of you as his pioneer brother roughing it in the wilderness." "That was true enough 15 years ago when I first came west," Edward replied, leading her into the house. "But Montana's been good to me. Started with fur trading, moved into mercantile goods, then land speculation when the territory began to develop. These days, I'm primarily involved in banking and real estate." The interior of the house was equally impressive, well-furnished rooms with carpets, wallpaper, and even a piano in the parlor. A middle-aged woman with a kind face appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "This is Mrs. Hollister, our housekeeper," Edward introduced. "Martha, this is my niece, Miss Victoria Maynard." "Welcome, Miss Maynard," Mrs. Hollister said warmly. "Your room is all prepared upstairs. Would you like to rest before dinner? You must be exhausted from your journey." Victoria gratefully accepted the offer, following the housekeeper upstairs to a lovely bedroom with views of the surrounding countryside. After a proper bath, her first in nearly 2 weeks, and dressed in clean clothes provided by her uncle, Victoria felt reborn. As she sat at the dressing table brushing her hair, she studied her reflection, noting the changes in herself. Her skin was tanned from days in the sun, her posture straighter, her eyes somehow clearer and more direct. The journey had changed her in ways that went beyond the physical, giving her a confidence and self-reliance she hadn't possessed before. The sound of hoofbeats outside drew her to the window. Colton had arrived, looking uncomfortable but handsome in clean clothing, his hair neatly combed, his beard trimmed. Victoria's heart quickened at the sight of him dismounting, handing the reins to a stable boy, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for battle before approaching the house. Dinner was a surprisingly pleasant affair. Edward Maynard proved to be an engaging host, genuinely interested in hearing the full story of Victoria's journey. Colton, initially reserved, gradually relaxed as the meal progressed, even sharing some of the more amusing incidents from their travels. "So you actually caught the fish with your bare hands?" Edward laughed, refilling Colton's wine glass. "It's not as difficult as it sounds," Colton replied with a small smile. "Just requires patience and knowing where to look." "Mr. Whittaker is being modest," Victoria interjected. "He has remarkable skills. Hunting, tracking, reading weather patterns, he knew exactly when and where to seek shelter during that terrible storm." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "Such knowledge is invaluable in this territory. Tell me, Mr. Whittaker, what business brings you to Fort Benton?" "Trading mainly. Furs in winter, guide services in summer for hunting parties. And you live?" "Cabin near Serpent Ridge, built it myself 3 years back." Edward seemed impressed. A self-sufficient man, admirable in these times when too many rely on others for their basic needs. He turned to Victoria. "You were fortunate indeed to have such a capable protector, my dear." Victoria caught Colton's eye across the table. "Yes, I was." After dinner, Edward excused himself to attend to some correspondence, suggesting that Victoria show Colton the gardens while the evening was still pleasant. They walked in silence for a few moments, following a gravel path through carefully tended flower beds. "Your uncle seems like a good man," Colton observed. "Yes, he does," Victoria agreed. "Much warmer than I remembered and certainly more prosperous. This is quite a place." Colton gestured to the substantial house and surrounding property. "Different from what you expected," Victoria nodded. "I thought I'd be living in much humbler circumstances, teaching in a one-room schoolhouse, helping with basic chores. This is..." She trailed off, uncertain how to express her conflicted feelings, "more like what you left behind in Boston, in some ways. Though there's still a frontier quality to everything here, a sense of possibility of building something new." They reached a small gazebo overlooking a pond. The setting sun cast golden light across the water, creating a scene of tranquil beauty. Victoria paused, turning to face Colton. "When will you return to your cabin?" she asked, unable to keep a note of sadness from her voice. "Tomorrow, probably. No reason to linger in town." "Except me," Victoria said softly. Colton's eyes met hers, intense and conflicted. "Victoria, I meant what I said yesterday," she interrupted. "About seeing each other. I don't expect promises or declarations, but I'm not ready to say goodbye." He stepped closer, his hand reaching up to touch her cheek with surprising gentleness. "I'm not good at this, at feelings, at saying what needs saying." "Then don't say anything," Victoria whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "I'll come back," he said simply. "In a month, when the first autumn furs start coming in. I'll come back and see you then." It wasn't a declaration of love, but coming from Colton, it was a profound commitment nonetheless. Victoria squeezed his hand, happiness blooming within her. "I'll hold you to that promise, Mr. Whittaker." A month passed more quickly than Victoria could have imagined. She settled into life at her uncle's homestead, getting to know Edward better and preparing for her teaching position, which would begin with the fall term in September. Fort Benton proved to be a fascinating community, more cosmopolitan than she had expected, with residents from all over the world drawn by the fur trade, gold mining, and the steamboat traffic along the Missouri. Edward introduced Victoria to the town's leading families, many of whom had children who would be her future pupils. She was invited to social gatherings, church functions, and even a surprisingly sophisticated literary society that met monthly to discuss books and poetry. Yet despite these distractions, Victoria found her thoughts returning constantly to Colton. She wondered what he was doing, whether he was safe in his solitary cabin, if he thought of her as often as she thought of him. She began counting the days until his promised return, trying not to let her anticipation show too obviously. Edward, however, was more perceptive than she gave him credit for. One evening, as they sat in the parlor after dinner, he broached the subject she had been avoiding. "You care for him, don't you?" he asked gently. "Whittaker, I mean." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Is it that obvious?" Edward smiled. "Only to someone who knows you well, and while we may have been separated by distance for many years, you are very much your mother's daughter." She could never hide her feelings either. Victoria set aside her embroidery, facing her uncle directly. "Does it disapprove you?" "Why would it?" Edward seemed genuinely surprised. "He's a man of integrity and courage. He saved your life, Victoria. That counts for a great deal in my estimation." "But he's not." Victoria hesitated. "He's not the sort of man someone from our background would typically consider suitable." Edward laughed. "My dear, we're in Montana territory, not Boston. The usual rules of society matter far less here than a person's character and abilities." His expression grew more serious. "I've made some inquiries about Whittaker. He has a solid reputation, honest in his dealings, skilled at his trade, keeps his word. Those qualities mean more on the frontier than social position or wealth." Relief washed over Victoria. "Thank you, Uncle. Your approval means a great deal to me." "I didn't say I approved just yet," Edward replied with a twinkle in his eye, "only that I don't disapprove based on conventional considerations. I would, however, like to know him better before offering my blessing on any serious attachment." "He's coming back," Victoria said, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. "In a few days. He promised to return when he brings furs to trade." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps we should invite him to stay here rather than at the hotel. That would provide an opportunity for better acquaintance." The suggestion both thrilled and terrified Victoria. Having Colton as a guest in her uncle's home would bring him firmly into her daily life, crossing the boundary between her wilderness adventure and her new existence in Fort Benton. "Do you think he would accept such an invitation?" she wondered aloud. "We won't know unless we ask," Edward replied pragmatically, "though I suspect he might if the invitation comes from you." 3 days later, Victoria was in town with Mrs. Hollister, selecting fabric for new curtains in the schoolhouse, when she heard a familiar voice outside the general store. "No, I need the heavy gauge. The fine wire snaps in winter temperatures." Her heart leaped at the sound. Abandoning the bolt of calico she'd been examining, Victoria hurried to the door, ignoring Mrs. Hollister's startled exclamation. Colton stood at the counter, discussing trap supplies with the proprietor. He looked the same as she remembered, perhaps a bit more weathered from his time in the wilderness, his hair slightly longer but unmistakably himself. Before Victoria could call out to him, he turned, as if sensing her presence. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the crowded store. Then, with a nod to the shopkeeper, Colton made his way toward her, navigating around barrels and display cases with his usual fluid grace. "Victoria," he said simply when he reached her. "You came back," she replied, unable to keep the smile from her face. "I said I would." They stood awkwardly, both acutely aware of the curious glances from other customers. Mrs. Hollister appeared at Victoria's elbow, eyebrows raised questioningly. "Mrs. Hollister, this is Mr. Colton Whittaker," Victoria introduced, "the man who rescued me and brought me safely to Fort Benton." "Colton, this is my uncle's housekeeper, Mrs. Martha Hollister." Recognition dawned in the older woman's eyes. "Oh, Mr. Whittaker, we've heard so much about you." She offered her hand, which Colton shook politely. "Miss Victoria has been watching the road for days. Mrs. Hollister." Victoria protested, mortified. The housekeeper merely smiled innocently. "Well, we should finish our shopping, Miss Victoria. Perhaps Mr. Whittaker would like to join us for dinner this evening. I'm making venison stew." Before Victoria could respond, Colton spoke up. "I'd be honored, madam." "If it's no trouble." "No trouble at all," Mrs. Hollister assured him. "Shall we say 6 o'clock?" With arrangements made, Colton returned to his business, promising to see Victoria that evening. As she watched him walk away, Victoria found herself already counting the hours until dinner. The meal proved to be even more successful than Victoria had hoped. Edward and Colton discovered a shared interest in Montana's political future, debating the territory's prospects for statehood with surprising passion. Mrs. Hollister's venison stew was excellent, and the atmosphere was relaxed and welcoming. When Edward extended the invitation for Colton to stay at the homestead during his time in Fort Benton, Victoria held her breath, uncertain how he would respond to such domesticity. "That's very generous, Mr. Maynard," Colton said slowly, "but I wouldn't want to impose." "Nonsense," Edward insisted. "We have plenty of room, and it would be a shame for you to spend good money on a hotel when friends can offer hospitality." Colton glanced at Victoria, a question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, hoping he could read her silent plea. "All right," he agreed finally. "Thank you. I'll bring my things over tomorrow." That night, Victoria could barely sleep, her mind racing with possibilities. Having Colton under the same roof, seeing him at breakfast each morning, sharing conversations in the evening, it was more than she had dared to hope for. The next few days established a pattern that felt surprisingly natural. Colton would ride into town each morning to conduct his business trading furs, purchasing supplies, meeting with contacts while Victoria attended to her preparations for the upcoming school term. In the evenings, they would gather in Edward's study or on the veranda. Sharing the day's events over coffee or brandy, Victoria found herself falling more deeply in love with Colton with each passing day. She cherished the quiet moments between them, their morning walks to the stables, their conversations about books she was considering for her students, the way his eyes followed her across a room when he thought no one was watching. On the fourth evening of his stay, they found themselves alone on the veranda after Edward had retired early with a headache. The night was warm, stars scattered across the velvet sky like diamonds on black cloth. "I never expected this," Colton said suddenly, breaking a comfortable silence. "Expected what? To feel at home here with you and your uncle?" He stared out at the darkened landscape. "It's been a long time since I felt that anywhere." Victoria's heart swelled with emotion. "Does it frighten you, feeling at home?" "A little," he admitted with surprising candor. "Makes a man vulnerable, having something to lose. Or something to live for," Victoria countered gently. Colton turned to her then, the moonlight illuminating his features. "Victoria, I'm not the kind of man who finds words easily, especially about feelings. But these past months, knowing you, being with you, it's changed something in me." She held her breath, afraid to interrupt the moment. "I told myself it was foolish," he continued. "That you deserve better than a solitary trapper with nothing to offer but a hard life in the wilderness. That I was too set in my ways, too damaged by the past to be what you need." "Colton," he held up a hand, stopping her. "Let me finish, please. I need to say this while I have the courage." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Victoria Maynard. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you collapsed at my feet, so determined to survive despite everything you'd been through, and every day since has only deepened that feeling." Tears welled in Victoria's eyes, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have almost from the beginning, though I tried to tell myself it was just gratitude or the unusual circumstances of our meeting." Colton stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I can't offer you a life like this," he gestured to the grand house behind them. "My cabin is small, the winters are harsh, and the nearest neighbors are miles away." "I don't need a grand house," Victoria replied. "I need you, Colton." The man who rescued me not just from a burning wagon but from a life half-lived, always wondering what might have been if I'd had the courage to follow my heart. He lifted one hand to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palm. Are you sure, really sure? Because once I kiss you, Victoria Maynard, I don't think I'll ever be able to let you go. Her answer was to rise on tiptoes and press her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, then deepened as Colton's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. Victoria felt as though she were falling and flying simultaneously, her heart so full it might burst from her chest. When they finally separated, both breathless, Colton rested his forehead against hers. Your uncle will have my hide for this, he murmured. Victoria laughed softly. I think he rather expects it, actually. He's been watching us with the most insufferable knowing expression these past few days. Smart man, your uncle, Colton observed, not releasing his hold on her. Smarter than me, certainly, for recognizing the treasure you are much sooner. Does this mean you'll stay longer? Victoria asked, hope evident in her voice. I need to return to my cabin eventually, Colton replied. Winter preparations can't wait, but he hesitated. Would you consider coming with me, just to visit, he added quickly. To see if you could imagine a life there before making any permanent decisions. Victoria's heart soared at the suggestion. Yes, she said without hesitation. I would like that very much. The next morning, Victoria approached her uncle in his study, determined to speak openly about her feelings for Colton and her desire to visit his cabin. To her surprise, Edward seemed to have anticipated the conversation. You've fallen in love with him, he stated simply, setting aside the ledger he'd been reviewing. Victoria nodded, not bothering to deny it. Yes, uncle, and he with me. Edward smiled, rising to embrace his niece. I could see it happening day by day. He's a good man, Victoria. Different from what your parents might have chosen for you, but then they didn't know the person you would become out here. He's asked me to visit his cabin, Victoria continued, heartened by her uncle's acceptance. To see if I could imagine a life there. Edward raised an eyebrow. A significant step, and you're considering it? I've already agreed, Victoria admitted. The school term doesn't begin for another month, and I've completed most of my preparations. I would be back in plenty of time. Her uncle studied her for a long moment. You're a grown woman, Victoria, capable of making your own decisions. If you believe this is right for you, I won't stand in your way. His expression grew more serious, but I would suggest a compromise for propriety's sake. Perhaps Mrs. Hollister could accompany you. She's been talking about visiting her sister near Serpent Ridge for months now. Victoria hadn't considered the question of propriety, but she recognized the wisdom in her uncle's suggestion. While frontier morality was more relaxed than Boston's rigid standards, her position as the new schoolteacher made her reputation a matter of community concern. That seems a reasonable arrangement, she agreed. Thank you for understanding, Uncle Edward. He patted her hand affectionately. Your happiness matters to me, my dear, and anyone with eyes can see that man adores you. Just make sure you're certain before committing to a life so different from what you've known. 2 days later, Victoria found herself once again traveling the trail between Fort Benton and Serpent Ridge, this time with Colton beside her and Mrs. Hollister following discreetly behind in a small wagon. The journey felt different now, no longer an uncertain escape, but a deliberate choice, a step toward a future she was increasingly eager to embrace. They reached Colton's cabin on the third day, arriving as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the clearing. Victoria was struck anew by the beauty of the setting. The cabin nestled against a backdrop of pine forest, a small stream bubbling nearby, wildflowers dotting the surrounding meadow. Mrs. Hollister continued on to her sister's homestead a few miles distant, promising to return in a week to accompany Victoria back to Fort Benton. The arrangement gave Victoria and Colton time alone while maintaining the appearance of propriety. As Colton helped Victoria from her horse, a sense of homecoming washed over her, surprising in its intensity. This place, so different from anywhere she had lived before, called to something deep within her, a longing for simplicity, for connection to the natural world, for the authentic life that Colton represented. "Welcome home," he said softly, as if reading her thoughts. Victoria smiled, taking his hand as they walked toward the cabin. "Show me everything." The tour was brief. The cabin consisted of just one main room with a stone fireplace, a small sleeping alcove, and a lean-to addition that served as storage space. Yet Victoria found herself charmed by the ingenious efficiency of the space, the careful craftsmanship evident in every detail. "You built all this yourself?" she asked, running her hand along a smoothly planed shelf. "Every bit," Colton confirmed. "Took most of that first summer. Started with just the main room, added the rest as I could." Victoria moved to the window, gazing out at the clearing. "And there's your garden. What do you grow? Potatoes, beans, corn, some root vegetables that store well for winter." "Game is plentiful, and I smoke meat for the months when hunting is poor." She turned to face him, suddenly serious. "Could it support 2 people, a family, eventually?" Colton's expression softened. "Yes." "It would mean expanding some more garden space, perhaps some chickens, another room on the cabin." "But yes, Victoria, it could support a family." The week that followed was a revelation for Victoria. Each day brought new experiences, learning to cook on a wood stove, helping Colton tend the garden, watching him repair traps and clean his rifles with meticulous care. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, occasionally reading aloud from one of the few books Colton possessed, mostly practical guides to survival, but also, surprisingly, a well-worn volume of Emerson's essays. "My father gave it to me before I left for the war," Colton explained when Victoria expressed surprise at finding the philosopher's work in his cabin. "Said it might help me make sense of things when times got hard." "Did it?" Victoria asked, turning the treasured volume in her hands. "Sometimes." Emerson understood something about living deliberately, about finding meaning in the natural world. That resonated with me, especially after. He trailed off, but Victoria understood, after losing his family, after finding himself alone in a world that suddenly made no sense. On their last evening before Mrs. Hollister was due to return, Victoria and Colton sat on a fallen log near the stream, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. A comfortable silence had settled between them, the kind that comes only with deep understanding. "I could be happy here," Victoria said finally, voicing the conclusion she had reached days earlier but had been afraid to articulate. Colton turned to her, hope and caution warring in his expression. "Are you certain? It's a hard life, Victoria." "Isolated, especially in winter when the snow makes travel difficult. No society, no neighbors dropping by for tea, none of the comforts you're used to." "I've considered all that," she replied steadily. "I'm not saying it would be easy. I would miss certain things, books, music, regular contact with other women, but those are small sacrifices compared to what I would gain." "And what would that be?" he asked softly. Victoria met his gaze directly. "You, Colton, a life with you. The chance to build something meaningful together, to face whatever comes as partners." She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I love you. I want to be your wife if you'll have me." For a moment, Colton seemed unable to speak, overwhelmed by emotion. Then, with a gentleness that belied his strength, he gathered Victoria into his arms. "Victoria Maynard," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "Nothing would make me happier than to have you as my wife, but I need you to be absolutely sure. Teaching in Fort Benton would give you a good life, respect in the community, regular contact with your uncle." "A good life, perhaps," Victoria acknowledged, "but not the life I want, not the life I choose." She touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "I choose you, Colton, I choose us." His kiss was tender at first, then deepened with an intensity that took her breath away. When they finally parted, both were trembling with emotions too profound for words. "We should go back to the cabin," Colton said eventually. "It's getting dark." Victoria nodded, allowing him to help her to her feet. As they walked hand in hand toward the warm glow of the cabin windows, she felt a certainty she had never known before, that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with exactly the right person beside her. The return to Fort Benton brought both excitement and trepidation. Victoria and Colton had agreed to speak with Edward together, formally requesting his blessing for their marriage. Despite her uncle's earlier acceptance of their relationship, Victoria was nervous about announcing their decision to wed so quickly. Edward received the news with a mixture of resignation and genuine happiness for his niece. "I suspected this might be the outcome of your visit," he admitted. "Though I confess I hoped you might take more time to be certain." "I am certain, Uncle," Victoria assured him, "more certain than I've ever been about anything in my life." Edward turned to Colton. "And you, sir, are you prepared for the responsibilities of marriage?" "For providing for my niece, for protecting her well-being," Colton met the older man's gaze steadily. "I am. I can't offer Victoria the kind of material comfort you can provide, Mr. Maynard, but I swear to you that she will never lack for anything essential. And she will never doubt that she is loved and respected." After a long moment, Edward nodded. "Very well, you have my blessing for whatever that's worth." His serious expression gave way to a smile. "Though I insist the wedding take place here, where Victoria's new friends can attend, and where I can properly celebrate my only niece's marriage." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Victoria began her teaching position as planned, finding unexpected fulfillment in the eager faces of her students' children from all walks of frontier life, hungry for knowledge and surprisingly respectful of their new teacher. Colton returned to his cabin to make necessary preparations, expanding the garden, beginning construction on an additional room, laying in supplies for the coming winter. He rode to Fort Benton every weekend, staying at Edward's homestead and gradually becoming an accepted part of the community. The wedding was set for early October, after the harvest, but before the first heavy snows would make travel difficult. Victoria wrote to her few remaining friends in Boston, not expecting them to make the journey but wanting them to know of her happiness. To her surprise, two replied that they would indeed come: her former teaching colleague, Elizabeth, and her cousin Margaret, both adventurous souls who saw the trip west as a grand adventure. Edward insisted on providing Victoria with a proper trousseau, sending to St. Louis for fabrics and patterns. Mrs. Hollister and several women from town helped with the sewing, turning the project into a series of sociable gatherings that introduced Victoria more fully to the female community of Fort Benton. Through it all, Victoria's certainty only grew stronger. Each letter from Colton, laboriously written, she knew, as writing did not come easily to him, confirmed her decision. Each weekend visit deepened their understanding of each other, their plans for their shared future becoming more concrete with every conversation. The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, the October air carrying the first hint of winter but tempered by brilliant sunshine. The ceremony took place in Fort Benton's small church, filled to capacity with townsfolk, Edward's business associates, and Victoria's students, who presented their teacher with a handmade quilt as a wedding gift. Victoria wore a gown of ivory silk, simple in design but exquisitely made. As she walked down the aisle on her uncle's arm, her eyes found Colton waiting at the altar. He stood tall and proud in a new suit, Edward's insistence, his expression transforming from nervous tension to wonder as he watched his bride approach. The service was brief but meaningful, the couple exchanging vows they had written themselves. Victoria promised to support Colton in all his endeavors, to create a home filled with warmth and understanding, to face whatever hardships might come with courage and faith. Colton, his voice steady despite his initial nervousness, vowed to protect and cherish Victoria always, to value her wisdom and independence, to build a life worthy of the trust she had placed in him. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was both a promise and a celebration, witnessed by the community that had, in different ways, brought them to this moment. The reception at Edward's homestead lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and more food than Victoria had seen since leaving Boston. Colton, initially uncomfortable with so much attention, gradually relaxed as the festivities continued, even joining in the dancing with surprising grace. As the celebration wound down and guests began to depart, Edward presented the couple with his wedding gift, the deed to 50 acres adjoining Colton's property, expanding their holdings significantly and providing additional resources for their future. "This land has good water access and excellent soil for farming," Edward explained. "It should provide well for you both and for any children who might come along." Victoria embraced her uncle, tears of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you for everything." "Be happy, my dear," Edward replied softly. "That's all the thanks I need." The newlyweds departed the next morning, their wagon loaded with wedding gifts and supplies for the winter ahead. As Fort Benton disappeared behind them, Victoria felt not regret but anticipation for the life they would build together, for the challenges they would face, for the love that had brought them to this point and would carry them forward. The journey to Serpent Ridge seemed shorter this time, filled with conversation and laughter. Colton pointed out landmarks Victoria had missed on previous trips, sharing stories of his experiences in the territory, plans for improvements to the cabin, ideas for their future. When they crested the final hill and the cabin came into view, Victoria gasped in surprise. During his absences in Fort Benton, Colton had not only added the promised room but had also constructed a covered porch across the front of the cabin with a simple swing hanging from sturdy beams. "I wanted it to be welcoming," he explained almost shyly. "A proper home for my wife." Victoria's heart swelled with emotion. "It's perfect," she whispered. Colton halted the wagon in front of the cabin, then turned to Victoria with a smile that transformed his usually serious features. "There's one more tradition to observe," he said, climbing down and coming around to her side. Before she could respond, he had lifted her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold of their home with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Whittaker," he said, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "Home," Victoria repeated, looking around at the cabin that was now hers as much as his. The simple space had been transformed in subtle ways: curtains at the windows, a colorful rug on the floor, a shelf filled with books that she recognized as wedding gifts from her uncle and students. But more than these physical changes, it was Colton's presence that made it truly home: his strength and gentleness, his quiet integrity, his unwavering love. "I think I've been searching for this my whole life," she said softly, looking up into his eyes. "Not just a place, but a feeling, belonging. Purpose? I know exactly what you mean," Colton replied, drawing her closer. "I thought I'd found my peace in solitude, but I was wrong. It was just a way of hiding from the possibility of loss." He touched her face gently. "You made me brave enough to try again, Victoria. To believe in a future worth building." Their kiss was a promise renewed, a commitment to the life they would create together, a life that would certainly include hardships, but also joy, growth, and the deep satisfaction of facing each day side by side. Winter came early that year, blanketing the mountains and valleys in snow by mid-November. Victoria, who had initially worried about the isolation, found unexpected contentment in the rhythm of their days. Mornings were spent on necessary chores, tending to the chickens Colton had acquired, preparing meals, maintaining the cabin. Afternoons often found Victoria teaching Colton to read more fluently, or him showing her essential survival skills: how to snowshoe across deep drifts, how to identify animal tracks, how to predict weather changes from subtle signs in sky and wind. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, sometimes reading aloud from one of their books, sometimes simply talking, sharing thoughts and memories, dreams and fears. These quiet hours became sacred to them, both a time of deepening understanding, of building the foundation of their marriage on honesty and mutual respect. When spring finally arrived, bringing with it the renewal of the natural world, Victoria discovered that she was carrying their first child. The news filled Colton with a mixture of joy and terror: happiness at the prospect of fatherhood again, fear that history might repeat itself. "I can't lose you," he confessed one night, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "Either of you." Victoria covered his hand with her own. "You won't," she promised. We'll take every precaution. Edward has already arranged for the doctor from Fort Benton to attend the birth, and Mrs. Hollister has offered to come stay with us for the last month." Though still anxious, Colton threw himself into preparations, expanding the cabin again to create a proper nursery, building a cradle from carefully selected pine, constructing a more comfortable bed for Victoria. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, with Victoria maintaining her health and spirits despite the physical challenges. By late summer, as her time grew near, the promised help arrived: Dr. Miller from Fort Benton, Mrs. Hollister with her wealth of practical experience, and even Edward for a brief visit to check on his niece's welfare. Hannah Elizabeth Whittaker was born on a perfect September afternoon, entering the world with a lusty cry that immediately captured her father's heart. As Colton held his daughter for the first time, tears streaming unashamedly down his face, Victoria witnessed the final healing of the wounds he had carried for so long. "She's perfect," he whispered, gazing in wonder at the tiny face, the shock of dark hair, the miniature fingers that curled instinctively around his calloused thumb. Just like her mother. Edward, waiting anxiously outside during the birth, was summoned to meet his great niece. His usually composed demeanor crumbled at the sight of the newborn, and he made no attempt to hide his emotion. "She looks like you did as a baby," he told Victoria, gently touching Hannah's cheek. "Your mother would have been so proud." Life settled into a new pattern after Hannah's birth. The isolation that might once have seemed daunting now felt protective, a peaceful environment for their daughter to thrive, away from the noise and complications of town life. Victoria discovered reserves of strength and capability she hadn't known she possessed, managing both motherhood and their home with growing confidence. Colton proved to be a devoted father, endlessly patient with midnight feedings and diaper changes, singing old cavalry songs as lullabies, carrying Hannah with him as he worked around their property, pointing out birds and animals, plants and trees, instilling in her from the beginning a love for the natural world. As Hannah grew from infant to toddler to an energetic child of 4, their family expanded again with the birth of twins Henry Edward and Helen Rose, turning their once quiet cabin into a bustling home filled with laughter, occasional tears, and the constant wonder of watching their children discover the world. The years brought changes to their lives and to the territory around them. Montana achieved statehood in 1889, bringing new settlers, expanded trade, improved transportation. Colton adapted his livelihood, focusing more on guiding hunting parties and less on trapping as the fur trade declined. Victoria established a small school in their home, teaching not only their own children but several from neighboring homesteads that had sprung up as the area developed. Edward remained a constant presence in their lives, visiting regularly and doting on his great nieces and nephew. Though he often suggested they consider moving closer to Fort Benton as the children grew, he respected their decision to remain in the home they had built together. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch swing watching their children play in the yard, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "If that wagon hadn't been attacked, if I hadn't escaped the fire and collapsed at your feet, we might never have met," she mused. "It seems strange to be grateful for something so terrible." Colton took her hand, the gesture as natural as breathing after a decade of marriage. "I've thought about that often," he admitted. "How the worst moment of your life became the beginning of everything good in mine." Victoria leaned against his shoulder, watching Hannah organize her younger siblings in some elaborate game of her own invention. "Do you ever regret it? Giving up your solitude, taking on all this responsibility?" "Not for a single moment," Colton replied without hesitation. "You and the children, you're everything I never knew I wanted, everything I didn't believe I deserved." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You remember what you said that night by the stream, that you were choosing me, choosing us?" Victoria nodded, the memory still vivid after all these years. "I choose us too," Colton said simply. "Every morning when I wake up, every night when I go to sleep. I choose this life we've built, this family we've created. And I thank God every day that you had the courage to do the same." As the sun set behind the mountains they both loved, casting golden light across the home they had created together, Victoria knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. From the moment she had escaped that burning wagon and collapsed at his feet, Colton Whittaker had shielded her from every storm not by protecting her from life's challenges, but by standing beside her as they faced them together, partners in every sense of the word. Their story, which had begun in fire and desperation, had transformed into something beautiful and enduring, a testament to the power of love to heal, to renew, to create a future neither could have imagined alone. And as night fell over the Montana wilderness, bringing with it a canopy of stars and the promise of another day together, Victoria and Colton Whittaker held each other close, grateful for the journey that had brought them home.